As for me, I'm Kanad Bagchi. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at UVA. My research interests are in international law and the politics of money. And I study money from a political perspective, in the sense that I don't look at money as a neutral instrument, but as an instrument that orders and distributes wealth and resources within society. So money and class power is something that I deal with. Money and the question of subordination dependency that it creates, and so on and so forth. So I'm very interested in questions of how money and value sort of come together. And I'm sure we'll discuss this more as well. So I'll begin. I think Lisa, please begin.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for that really generous introduction, and thank you very much to the organisers and everyone whose labour has gone into making this event a reality, especially Ivana, Bagchi and Alicia. You've really done fantastic work. I'll start with the caveat that I suppose in disciplinary terms, I come from a political economy background. I've generally worked in politics departments, but I've taught and kind of researched in the area of political ecology for a really long time, and now I'm based in a development department. So at no point does law feature in any of those kind of affiliations and training. So somehow I end up, in these spaces as a complete imposter. So I'll just apologise for that. And any difficult questions around law, I will defer to the brilliant Rob Knox, who I'm sort of doing the warm-up act for anyway. So yeah, I wanted to talk about value, about scales and structures of value, just kind of throw in a few points that maybe we can think about, and drawing on some brilliant thinkers along the way. So I thought we could start by recognizing, how powerful value is, like the potency of value overall, as something which in itself organizes society, economy, ecology at various scales. And we can also recognize that value is obviously deeply related to race and gender. And especially in the sense that race and gender, or perhaps racialization and gendering, as we've been referring to these processes, these really determine the value of all sorts of things, including the labour power, whether that labour is valued at all, thinking about the feminized work of social reproduction here, also the value of land, according to whose land it's perceived to be, and equally resources and ecology. And we can also think about how race and gender determine or influence the differential value of life itself. So this being catastrophically evident now in the real-time genocide of Palestinians as racialized and colonized people whose lives are clearly of less value in the eyes of the powerful than lives racialized as white or otherwise. So if we think about this valuing on a world scale, the differential valuing of racialized labour, resources, land, natures, with on a world scale, cheapness roughly concentrated in the south, and value-added activities and resources kind of concentrated in the north. This continues to maintain what Samir Amin called the worldwide law of value. So I actually do law in some respect, if it's a means worldwide law of value. So Amin basically extended and adapted Marx's law of value into this law of worldwide or globalized value, which is, in Amin's own words, based on the hierarchical structuring, itself globalized, of the prices of labour power around its value, linked to the management practices governing access to natural resources. This globalization of value constitutes the basis for imperialist rent. So the basis for imperialist rent. In other words, extraction. And this goes back to So thinking about Diamond's emphasis this morning, drawing on Williams, on the importance of the cheapness of the labour, basically, in producing race itself. But we can also stress that that this cheapness needs to be actively produced and maintained. So establishing very deliberately the relative cheapness of southern labour and natures has been done through various mechanisms over time and in relation to various different projects. So mechanisms including the wholesale destruction of industries. If you think about the vibrant textile industry in pre-colonial India, through to what we're seeing again in real time, the wholesale destruction of Palestinian agriculture and other industries. So these are very kind of active, deliberate political projects which produce cheapness and devalue people and land and resources. You can also think about the mechanisms that Patnaik, for instance, draws attention to, the clever use of taxation, currency differences to cheapen commodities and facilitate the drain of wealth. There's a lot more that we can mention there, but I think that the broad point is that in addition to following, Rob's insistence really in refusing race as a natural fact, and accepting it instead as something that's very much produced through active forms of racialization, we also need to refuse cheapness as a natural fact as well. And of course, relative cheapness is one of the principal ways colonialism has maintained its channels of extraction, and since independence, the extraction of value to the former centres of colonial power, more or less, has continued to be enabled in part by the endurance of cheap labour and natures. So, of course, you have anti-colonial movements and the post-independence regimes that they influence very consciously. They sought to correct this global structure of value through various means, while former colonial and imperialist powers have sought to very deliberately to maintain it by keeping prices of southern resources cheap, and this is very much through bodyguarding those prices. And so, with a nod again to Rob's work and other people, more recently who've done work on neoliberalism as a project, especially in the analyses of Jessica White and Quinn Slobodian and others, this neoliberalism has been shown precisely to have been originally designed as a counter-revolution against these anti-colonial efforts to restructure value on a world scale. And within this neoliberal order, which has obviously had a lot of different kind of agents and architects since those original kind of designs by Montpellier Society and others, but within this neoliberal order, law has an increased leading role in producing and maintaining cheapness in the South through, for example, the World Trade Organization, investor-state dispute mechanisms, these kind of juridical formations, which, in Quinn Slobodian's terms, encase markets, insulate markets from those democratic pressures. And these really actively prevent, or try their hardest to prevent, southern economies from moving up through higher value-added sectors, basically. Okay. I sort of wanted to illustrate this, just bring it back to ecology. I mean, there's a really famous leaked memo, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, from 1991, from the then chief economist of the World Bank, a guy called Larry Summers. And you might have heard this before, but this leaked memo it reads as follows. It says, dirty industries. Just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the LDCs, less developed countries? And he goes on to list various reasons for this. And his first reason is that the measurement of the costs of health impairing pollution depends on the foregone earnings from increased morbidity and mortality. From this point of view, a given amount of health impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. So a real, quiet part loud moment from Larry Summers there. And he goes on to reason that areas with higher incomes and longer life expectancies are likely to be more concerned about health implications. So here, we have evidence of the World Bank head making the case for deliberately polluting global south countries, basically because they're worth less, both in his personal opinion and in terms of those global structures of value. And the calculus here is not based on, how many people are actually killed in terms of, or harmed by toxic industries in terms of numbers, but actually how much they are perceived to be worth in economic terms. So that's what I wanted to reflect on really on a world scale. But I also have another bit around the scale of the plantation and the structures of value, but am I out of time?
Can you do it in 2 minutes? Is that
I'll try. I'll go into like
much of my time,
double speed. So I wanted to shift to the scale of the plantation and try to think from that site. And I draw on some of Sylvia Winter's really amazing insights in the essay Novel and History, Plot and Plantation, which I've shared with you all. I hope you've had a chance to look over it. And the vital point here is that Winter reads the plantation itself as a distinct structure of value, which she analyzes alongside the plot as basically two contradicting formations or structures of value which characterize plantation societies in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And the plantation itself, it's really the original structure of rationalized industrial monocultural commodity production for the world's market, which is obviously bound up with the history of enslaved, coerced, exploited, racialized labor. And the plantation is both an expansive site of exploitation in itself, and it's also the model for other key sites of capitalism. So from the manufacturing plant, the industrial manufacturing plant, all the way through to the Amazon fulfillment center in terms of its rationalized monotonous sort of form. Whereas the plot, in contrast, is the site of subsistence production, social reproduction, where the conditions of life are reproduced for their own sake or for use rather than exchange and for capitalist accumulation. So within Winter, the plantation and the plot, in her analysis, they embody and represent distinct structures of value. And these also correspond to distinct but articulated modes of production, which are both potential and actually existing. So the piece that I shared, which is a reflection on Winter's essay for a forum on this, I tried to draw out how she sort of pushes us back to the real and tangible use value structure of the plot, and away from what she presents as the fiction of the monocultural monotonous plantation regime, which we know leads us to socio-ecological decay, basically. And I think it's interesting to think about how, well, if the plantation can exceed its boundaries and be reproduced in so many other sites, then surely the plot can do that too, can be reproduced elsewhere. So in this piece, I'm thinking about how movements like La Via Campesina and other anti-systemic movements have very explicitly returned to the value structure of the plot in recent decades, and tried to perform this very task of expanding the value structure of the plot beyond its confines. And so, I mean, I think what it means to go back to the plot is really to consciously think through metabolic repair along with an ecological repair, along with social repair, as well as to actively organise against the ecological rupture provoked by the exchange structure of the plantation. And in the piece, I end by saying that the plot as the basis for all socio-ecological reproduction, this actually does survive without the plantation. So the plot survives it in and of itself. But conversely, the plantation doesn't survive without the plot. It's completely dependent on it. So yeah, I hope some of this is kind of helpful, but overall, I just wanted to push us a little bit to think about different scales and structures of value in organising economy and ecology in relation to race in particular. So whether any of this is helpful to law is completely up to you.
So just first to say is that you really don't have to apologise for not being a lawyer. Jesus. Continue apologising for being lawyers. So I think honestly, good. You're not missing much. So in talking this through, it's kind of difficult because we spoke about methodology earlier, and in a sense, value is my methodology. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit, recapitulate some of the points I made earlier and talk through a little bit about that. And then I want to pivot a little bit to talk about debt specifically, and thinking about debt in relation to the kind of successive waves of colonial and neo-colonial experiments in Haiti, to use that to then think through a kind of conceptual thing about the kind of relationship between race and value. So I think it's obviously worth starting off by saying, actually what we tend to observe when people talking about these things is a significant separation, right? So one thing that I find really interesting in, let's say, contemporary Twail work, for instance, very often what you'll get is a story which is it used to be explicitly about race and now it's about GDP or it's about money. And that's an intuition which from the Marxist tradition is really wrong, because race was always about value and value was always about race, right? And so what I want to think about there is precisely that. So one of the things that, one of the great things that Lisa just did and is kind of helping me to not have to talk through this is that there is a dual thing here for me, which is that it's really crucial to see that in the kind of operations through which value is captured, race is not an added extra in many of these moments. Indeed, race is intervening at constant points to make things cheap, facilitate exploitation, set up what can happen to who and in what ways. So if you actually look to the history of capitalist accumulation and the centrality of the endless accumulation of value in that process, race is always there at various moments, particularly, of course, because this capitalist exploitation is expansive, transformative, and geopolitically differentiated. So you need race to step in order to make this possible, right? But at the same time, what's really important is to understand that the ways in which modes of racialization occur are themselves mediated through the kind of forms of the extraction of value that takes place. So one of the things that Andrea said earlier is okay, we have these forms of difference moving. Well, a crucial way in which these forms of difference move and change depends on different regimes of the way in which value is extractive, right? So capitalism has this endless drive to expand and to transform, and that is in the service and facilitation of accumulating value, expanding. That's a necessary condition of the existence of capital and capitalism. At the same time, it's producing these relations of racialization and these processes of racialization, both in a content sense, in the sense that it's we have to do this geopolitically differentiated exploitation, but also, as I said earlier, at this formal level, because capitalism is so concerned with modes of abstraction, right? So one of the reasons I then included like this little Fanon text, which I think is so useful, is that one of the things that Fanon points out is, because of this, race is real in the sense that it's kind of a real abstraction that does real organizational work in the world, but it's not fixed. It's incredibly protean and can change very rapidly at key moments. So one of the things, for instance, that I really wanted to expand upon, and I might do again, is what Parvati said about like, stop centralizing whiteness as being the only mode of race. There are some people, for instance, who would equate race and racism and racialization with white supremacy, and this to me is one of the least useful things that you can do, in part because it centers this kind of American story, but also because it misses the kind of work does in categorizing people who aren't white into different kind of categories. It misses the practices and patterns of racialization that have occurred with white people here. And I don't just mean, for instance, the story of, that we all know, how the Irish became white. I also mean, like, in the 1800s, English racists, with my name, Robert Knox, famous kind of race scientist, are like, the Germans are a race and the English are a race, in the sense that the race moves in this kind of way, and it moves within these kind of relations of value. So specifically, one thing I want to think about in this context is the operation of debt and sovereign debt in particular, and how the story of what happens with debt in terms of Haiti helps us really illustrate how these two things move together in particular ways. So one of the very interesting things that Marx talks about when he's thinking about debt, and I've discussed this here in an event that Ivana organized beforehand, in a testament to the power of Ivana's events, some of the kind of conceptualization here came from literal conversations about this. Like, one of the things that Marx says in relation to debt is there's almost this kind of dual thing about debt. On the one hand, right, debt is absolutely central to all forms of like capitalist accumulation. Capitalism involves huge expansion of accumulation, and successful capitals will have to take on credit and take on debt in order to expand. So in that sense, debt is this source of immense like power to accumulate value. But Marx also says debt can be a manner through which a money capitalist can exert control over those who are indebted to them. So debt is both this incredibly powerful thing that happens to let you expand, but it's also this mechanism that sucks you into relationships of exploitation. What explains that? Well, what explains that to many extents is racialization. Racialization is a tool through ideas of, let's call them, creditworthiness, through which this dual functionality of debt and its relationship to value can be fixed in particular processes involving the contestation of different capitalist powers in this kind of way. And crucially then, the entry of debt into the scene as a particular mode of extracting value has consequences for how racialization works, but also shows the way in which racialization helps to usher in and structure new configurations of the extraction of value. So if we look to the example of Haiti and its kind of long history in terms of its enmeshment in capitalist social relations, we get a very clear idea about this. I'm just going to pull out some vignettes here, talk about them a little bit, and kind of explain what they do. So everyone, of course, knows that, like, I assume everyone knows, that after the Haitian Revolution, when the Haitians throw off the kind of chains of slavery and become free people, the French eventually deign to say that they might recognize their recalcitrant colony's independence, but they do so in the midst of a naval blockade on the condition that the Haitians compensate the French for the lost slave property. And this has a double important purpose. The first thing that it means is that insofar as the Haitians agreed to do this, they are in some sense acknowledging the legitimacy of racialized slavery. Insofar as you're paying off a debt, you are in some kind of formal legal sense acknowledging the legitimacy of that. So in some sense, the Haitian state and the Haitian people are forced to perform a kind of acceptance of a racialized order through the medium of value. At the same time, that debt integrates the Haitian state very effectively into the orbit of emergent French structures, because the French banks lend the money and the French are able to get kind of preferential trading access. So race then becomes the condition through which, on a new basis, Haiti is reintegrated into an emergent world economy and into a set of relationships of value extraction. So it's crucial then to understand how it is that this racialized notion of slave debt determines the conditions upon which Haiti will now enter into a subordinate position in that. So that's vignette 1. Now, the point is that this particular modality of debt, along with a kind of constellation of other kind of debt experiments by various empires, inaugurates a kind of new mode of like neocolonialism avant la lettre, whereby it's like, okay, we can recognize that these states are in some sense independent, but through a kind of set of languages and practices of racialization, we can integrate them on a subordinate basis into this kind of emergent global economy. Second moment, right? Again, many of you will be aware of this, like that debt which is owed by the Haitian state to the French becomes property of Americans. Americans end up buying up a lot of that debt. Why do they do that? The reason they do that is because in the context of like the coming First World War, like the other part of the island of Santo Domingo, so the Dominican Republic, has significant German kind of influence there. And Germany is a kind of rival capitalist power. So again, notice this is not always just a story about dominated and dominators, but also about capitalist competition. And the US, in line with the Monroe Doctrine, which was an attempt to kind of stave off its capitalist rivals, wants to establish more of a foothold into the kind of the Haitian state and the Haitian economy, so as in part to push off its rivals. That accounts for the kind of increasing US interest in debt. But again, that is coupled with a series of practices on racialization, which go, look, even though Haiti is a kind of independent state, it cannot be trusted to manage this debt. And a constellation of racialized assumptions about the inability of native peoples to manage their own affairs comes to the fore to legitimate a series of interventions aimed at stabilizing value-producing relations in Haiti through this language, which both recognizes Haiti as like formally sovereign, but uses this language of racialization and this voluntarily accrued debt as a mode of intervention. So very famously, as again, some of you may or may not know, the US Marines at one point literally go into the Haitian National Bank, take out a bunch of gold, put it on some ships, and they're like, we can't trust you. They kind of do an army bank robbery, right? And that culminates in the US occupation of Haiti in like 1915, whereby the US, in a period of like kind of political turbulence, is like, we need to come in, and in part the reason we need to come in is to stabilize this because the Haitians have once again proved their inability to manage debt. And again, you see this kind of connection. Now, the crucial thing is, and this again is, all of this obviously is mediated through law and juridical relations. And this particularly comes to the fore in the context of the occupation, when at gunpoint, essentially, the Haitian state agrees to sign a treaty on the tranquility and stability, never what you want to use, of Haiti, whereby Haiti agrees that it will use the kind of money that it earns from its kind of customs duties to service US debt in the first instance, and then pay for the kind of US police force that's there in the second instance. So what you get here is the technology of like debt, race, and law, which come to be like, you can both state that Haiti is a kind of independent sovereign state, but by virtue of a constellation of racialized assumptions, can remain within the orbit of the US through its voluntary consent and therefore continue service to that debt. Now, crucially, this model is essentially what gets generalized in the function of international financial institutions, which go, you have consented to this because you have accrued debt. And one of the ways that race comes in here is as a depoliticizing measure, which says, well, we're not going to inquire into what it might be about the structure of the global economy, which means countries in the South have accrued debt. It says it's because they can't manage their own affairs. They have then voluntarily consented to that, which means they have publicly affirmed this story of racialization. And that is used to generate further interventions, transforming like the political economy where they are to further generate value. So in this way, that language of racialization is ushering in new modes and rounds of capitalist accumulation. And crucially, at the same time as that, those modes and rounds of capitalist accumulation are used to shape specific languages of racialization, which move from an older language of the kind of like biological or genetic inferiority of non-Europeans to a different language about their inability to manage and steward capitalist production processes, which necessitate these forms of intervention. So in this way, you get this changing conception of race and racialization, from a kind of logic which supports slavery to one which forces them to accept slavery, which ends up coexisting, allowing independence and intervention to coexist through these practices of racialization. And so in this sense, again, hopefully we get the illustration that these two kind of things are not separate things that come into contact with each other, but are in some sense specifically, I won't say co-constituted because I just dissed that already. Reduced. And that triad, mediated centrally through law, helps us to understand the role that race plays in value production, but also the role that value production plays in racialization.
Great. Thank you very much for those presentations. So I think this panel was rich also for the fact that it brought in many of the conversations that we were having since the morning. Like some method came up, value as a method. I think I would, at least one of my questions would be to sort of elaborate a bit on that, but I'll come to that a bit. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to discuss. So value as a method came back. So I think we also discussed several different ways and technologies of racialization or techniques of racialization. And I think it might make sense to think of racialization from the perspective of techniques, because even if the language of racialization keeps changing, and as we heard, does change over time, some of these techniques keep repeating itself. So one of the techniques that was important here was debt. Money for me has been another technique through which subordination and domination is sort of produced and reproduced. So techniques, so we have methods, we have techniques. We also have a notion of how perhaps we might want to approach value. So how do we look at value? So what is value? And is it a thing? No, of course not. It's not a thing. I mean, as the presentations were clear that value perhaps is best understood as a set of relations, processes, perhaps mechanisms employed through law, but not necessarily law. But value also has this tendency of abstraction, is what we learned, flowing from the first panel to now. Abstraction in the sense of homogenizing at one level, but also creating difference and stratification. Yes, so I think these are some of the things that this panel also sort of brought together. I have one question for Lisa.